was called the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, a physician whose decisions helped decide who lived and who died. Then, instead of standing trial, he vanished into decades of rumor, false names, and fugitive anonymity. What happened to Josef Mengele, and how did a man so infamous slip the reach of international justice for so long? Josef Mengele was born in southern Germany in 1911 and trained as a physician and anthropologist in the 1930s. He joined Nazi organizations as the regime consolidated power and by the war years held the rank of SS officer. In 1943, he was assigned to the concentration and extermination complex at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There, his role as an SS doctor placed him at the center of the camp's selection process. Those judged fit for work were separated from those marked for immediate death. Alongside selections, Mengele conducted medical and genetic research on prisoners, actions that have become central to his reputation for cruelty. The historical record is clear about his institutional position and the deeds for which he is remembered. Historians, survivors, and archival documents have established the outline of his wartime role without the need for sensational detail. The end of Nazi Germany in 1945 did not mean immediate accountability for everyone who had administered or enabled mass murder. As the Third Reich collapsed, Europe descended into chaos. Cities lay in ruins, governments were reconstituting, refugee flows moved across borders by the hundreds of thousands, and administrative systems, including police and judicial records, were fractured. In this environment, many perpetrators slipped away, capitalizing on destroyed papers, distracted authorities, and the sheer scale of displacement. Mengele left Auschwitz as the Soviet army advanced in January 1945. He returned briefly to Germany, where, like many former SS officers, he attempted to dissolve his formal ties to Nazi organizations and to blend back into civilian life. But his profile, the memories of survivors, camp records, made residence in post-war Germany dangerous. Over the next few years, he sought routes out of Europe. The mechanism by which many Nazis escaped in the late 1940s and early 1950s is now familiar in outline. Networks of facilitators, forged or improvised documents, sympathetic intermediaries, and ports of departure in southern Europe. These clandestine escape routes, commonly called rat lines, varied in organization and personnel. Some were informal, run by individuals with ideological sympathy or personal connections, while others exploited the confusion of post-war bureaucracy and relief operations to obtain travel papers or transit visas. Records indicate that by 1949, Mengele had reached South America, a destination for a substantial number of former Nazis and collaborators. Argentina in particular became a haven for arrivals in the late 1940s and 1950s. A porous immigration system, political currents inside the country, and established expatriate communities made it practicable for fugitives to settle. Over the following years, Mengele is documented as moving across South America, spending time in Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil. The precise itinerary includes documented stays and credible testimony that place him in Buenos Aires in the 1950s, in Paraguay during parts of the late 1950s and early 1960s, and later in São Paulo State in Brazil. Where the documentary trail is patchy, historians and investigators flag uncertainty. In other places, papers, witness accounts, and later police inquiries provide firmer anchors. Mengele's survival in exile rested on a combination of practical evasive measures and the structural weaknesses of post-war justice. He adopted aliases and false identities to avoid recognition. He lived not as a public figure, but often in rural or fringe communities where foreigners blended into the background. He moved frequently, sometimes across borders within South America, which made long-term surveillance and arrest more difficult. Forged or sympathetic issued documents provided legal cover for travel and residence, and crucially, international law enforcement in the immediate post-war decades lacked the technological and cooperative infrastructure that would later make transnational manhunts more effective. No centralized databases, limited forensic techniques, uneven extradition agreements, and varying political will among states. All of these factors reduced the probability that a single lead would quickly lead to arrest. At the same time, a network of actors, formal and informal, pursued him. Interpol circulated notices. National police forces received tips and investigated leads. Independent Nazi hunters and survivor organizations compiled dossiers and followed sightings. High-profile successes, most famously the capture of Adolf Eichmann by Israeli intelligence in 1960 in Argentina, demonstrated both the possibility of cross-border operations and the obstacles involved. Eichmann's seizure and trial exposed the existence of fugitive communities in Buenos Aires and galvanized public attention, but it also had the paradoxical effect of driving other wanted men deeper into hiding. After Eichmann, some fugitives altered their patterns, changing names, moving to even more remote locations, adopting quieter lives. Mengele appears to have done exactly that, cultivating a low-profile existence that avoided the kinds of social circles and business dealings that had exposed Eichmann. Investigators pursued numerous threads over the decades. Nazi hunters and former survivors tracked reported sightings. National police forces opened cases when names or papers surfaced. Academic researchers and journalists published leads that occasionally produced fresh inquiries. Some reports looked promising, but ultimately produced no arrestable proof. There were documented visits to neighborhoods, interviews with neighbors and acquaintances, and occasional raids or searches based on tip-offs. None produced the legal certainty needed to place Mengele on trial. Part of the difficulty was that local officials at times prioritized domestic concerns or lacked resources to carry out prolonged undercover operations. In other instances, witnesses were reluctant to come forward, or memories conflicted. Patterns of misidentification were common. A man's accent, age, or manner could trigger suspicion in one town and be dismissed in the next. Rumors and alleged sightings followed Mengele throughout his exile. Some reports, individuals claiming to have seen him in small Argentine towns, in Paraguayan hamlets, or in Brazilian coastal communities, circulated widely. Investigators treated many of these as leads, but ultimately labeled them unconfirmed. The public fascination with the figure and the trail of failed identifications fostered a climate in which rumor and reality were often difficult to separate. Responsible histories distinguish between verified records, immigration documents, witness statements corroborated by multiple sources, intercepted correspondence, and unverified claims that never produced concrete proof. Where evidence was weak or contradictory, historians and police reports make that uncertainty explicit. There are reasons why Mengele, in particular, eluded capture longer than some other senior Nazis. Unlike Eichmann, who worked within a structured bureaucratic apparatus and maintained a public, traceable life in exile, Mengele was a medical officer who often lived as a private man, sometimes under assumed names and with fewer public connections. His mobility across borders and preference for rural hideouts reduced encounters with law enforcement and investigative journalists. He also benefited from the sheer number of suspects and the limited resources of the agencies pursuing them. After the immediate post-war years, priorities shifted, and many governments focused first on reconstruction and domestic politics. By the 1950s and 1960s, while some countries increased cooperation on war crimes investigations, processes were uneven. When the possibility of capture increased, for example after Eichmann, fugitives adapted. The accepted closing chapter on Mengele's life begins in February 1979 in Brazil. According to multiple investigative accounts and local records, he suffered a stroke while swimming off the coast of São Paulo state and drowned. At the time, his death was reported locally under an alias. Authorities buried the body in a cemetery near São Paulo. For many years, the identity of the grave's occupant remained a subject of inquiry and dispute. It was only through later investigative work, exhumations, forensic analysis of bones, dental records, and eventually comparative DNA and morphological testing with family reference material that most forensic experts and governmental authorities concluded that the remains were indeed Josef Mengele's. The sequence of scientific confirmations took time, and the gap between the reported 1979 death and later forensic closure fueled speculation. In the 1980s, investigators exhumed remains believed to be his, and forensic anthropologists compared the skeleton to photos, dental charts, and other antemortem records. Subsequent genetic testing, carried out when DNA techniques matured and when samples from living relatives could be compared, strengthened the identification. By the early 1990s, a convergence of physical, dental, and genetic evidence led a majority of historians and official investigators to accept that the man who died in Brazil in 1979 was Josef Mengele. This represented posthumous confirmation rather than judicial reckoning, a forensic answer to a question of identity, not a courtroom determination of legal guilt, though the historical record of his crimes remains clear. There is an ethical and legal lesson in that distinction. For survivors and families of victims, a trial is not merely a mechanism for historical accounting. It is a public forum where responsibility is acknowledged and tested under law. The fact that Mengele avoided that process, dying outside a courtroom, his culpability never adjudicated by a judicial body after World War II, was for many a painful reminder of the limits of post-war justice. The international legal order after 1945 did hold many perpetrators to account. Trials at Nuremberg and at subsequent national tribunals established important precedents. But the system was imperfect, and many factors, geography, resources, political will, and the passage of time, shaped who faced justice and who did not. There are additional collective lessons. The story of Mengele's escape highlights how networks and bureaucratic gaps enabled flight. It shows how the dispersal of responsibility across states and institutions, combined with the chaos of the immediate post-war years, created openings that some exploited. It also demonstrates the evolution of investigative tools. Where mid-century investigators relied on paper records and eyewitness accounts, later decades benefited from improved forensic science, international police cooperation, and more systematic archival research. The work of dedicated investigators, survivors, and researchers over many decades gradually reconstructed the path of a fugitive whose notoriety made anonymity paradoxical, yet achievable. Public memory and myth-making also play a role in this history. The inability to bring Mengele to trial for so long allowed rumors and apocryphal stories to flourish. That myth-making has been harmful in several ways. It can obscure the ordinary mechanisms of escape and complicity that made flight possible. It can sensationalize suffering rather than honoring survivors' experiences, and it can distract attention from documented responsibility by substituting speculation for evidence. Careful historical work seeks to cut through rumor by returning to archives, corroborated testimony, and forensic science. Mengele's life and death force a sober reflection about accountability. There is moral clarity about his acts. He participated in policies and practices that inflicted grave violence on prisoners at Auschwitz, and historical records support that condemnation. The frustration that his death prevented a public trial is understandable and justified. Yet the ensuing decades of investigation, documentation, and eventual forensic confirmation contributed to the historical record in other ways. They gathered evidence that feeds scholarship, nourishes public memory, and supports educational work so that societies remember both victims and mechanisms of atrocity. For present-day audiences, the case underscores the importance of institutional vigilance and international cooperation in addressing crimes against humanity. It also serves as a warning about the fragility of legal and moral frameworks in moments of systemic collapse. When structures break down, the systems intended to enforce accountability, police, courts, immigration records, can be disrupted in ways that allow perpetrators to evade justice. The long effort to trace and identify Mengele illustrates how difficult, necessary, and ultimately collective the work of historical reckoning can be. In the end, the question posed at the start has two answers that together complete the story. What happened to Josef Mengele is now broadly understood. He fled Europe at the end of the war, lived under false identities in South America, and died in Brazil in 1979, and how he evaded justice is equally instructive. A combination of wartime chaos, escape networks, falsified identities, mobility across borders, and uneven post-war investigative capacity allowed him to avoid trial. The moral burden of his actions did not disappear with his death. Historians, investigators, and educators have continued to document and teach about the crimes he helped carry out, so that the historical record, if not the courtroom, preserves accountability. If you want a fuller sense of how one fugitive, Adolf Eichmann, was captured and brought to trial, and how that case reshaped international pursuit of war criminals, See our deep dive on Eichmann's capture. For now, remember that the pursuit of truth after atrocity is often slow, imperfect, and vital. Imperfect because not every perpetrator will face a courtroom. Vital because the record must be kept and the lessons passed on. If this account helped clarify the story for you, subscribe for more historical investigations and watch our related videos on post-war justice and Nazi escape networks.